Shabbat shalom, everybody. Shabbat shalom. Being new to both Holy Blossom and the rabbinate, the other day, in a very human moment, I had to purchase some new clothes for work. As I perused the store, however, all of a sudden, I heard someone shouting around the corner. After a brief moment of panic, I realized that it was another customer, yelling at one of the cashiers about returning a previous purchase. It was literally something straight out of one of those videos we've all seen on the internet of one of those so-called Karens, apologies to all Karens, including my own mother, in which a customer flies into an unprovoked rage at a worker, for example, at a cafe, in a store, on a plane, or so on. Thankfully, in this instance, they calmed down quite quickly, but seeing this scene play out was, to say the least, eye-opening. In taking a step back to process, I wondered, was this outburst worth it? So let's pause scene and enter Torah instead. As we begin the book of Devarim, the namesake of our portion this morning, we will notice that Moses starts out our parashah with an outburst of his own. Contextually, Devarim can be thought of as, yes, Moses' monologue, as Rabbi Slansky pointed out, but in 4 different parts, delivered to the people of Israel at the border of the Promised Land. Although the people are about to cross over, Moses is fully aware that he will die before he has the opportunity to go with them. With this being Moses' last chance to address his people, I found it rather surprising that with his death on the horizon, he should choose to make his final words full of tochacha, rebuke. We open with the words, Ela hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. We opened with these words, so beautifully read by Jeff. These are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel. This is a key point of reference, as the rabbis of the Sifrei, the ancient collection of midrashim on the book of Deuteronomy, note that every time the verb diber, to speak, is used, it indicates harshness or rebuke. This is opposed to amar, also to speak or to say, which they tell us conveys a sense of praise. Thus, we are signaled from the following passages that the following passages will involve chastisement. And indeed, Moses will then spend significant time recounting how he could not stand the people's bickering as they made their way through the desert, and of how he had to appoint a council of wise and insightful people, anashim hachamim unvonim uviduim, to assist him in bearing this burden. That being said, maybe it's not surprising at all, because we as Jews actually value rebuke, and in fact, welcome it. We read earlier in our Torah in Leviticus 19, Hoheach tohiach et amitecha, rebuke your neighbor. This passage is, in fact, part of what is known as the Holiness Code, the section of the Torah renowned for many of our moral imperatives, such as not to put a stumbling block in front of the blind, or, most famously, to love your neighbor as yourself. It is perhaps no coincidence then that we read that particular passage on Yom Kippur afternoon. This leads us to, we welcome rebuke because we believe, when done correctly, it is an act of love. In the Talmud we learn that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, I call heaven and earth to witness for myself that Rabbi Akiva was often punished on my behalf because I used to complain against him to Rabban Gamliel. And all the more he showered love upon me to make true what has been said, do not give tochacha to a scorner, lest that person hate you. Give tochacha to a wise person, that they shall love you. Rebuke, therefore, is seen as a symbol of love intended to help the receiver grow wiser. We further welcome rebuke because we believe it is an act of responsibility. Rabbi Jonathan Blake, formerly of Westchester Reformed Temple in New York, highlights that Judaism demands that each of us act responsibly toward one another. This necessitates not only that we encourage good behaviour in others, but also that we are honest with them when they stray. Judaism sees effective rebuke as a measure of our sincere desire to multiply goodness in the world. The Talmud in Tractate Shabbat says, "Whoever can stop the members of this household from committing a sin but does not, is responsible for the sins of their household. If they can stop the people of their city from sinning but do not, they are held responsible for the sins of the people of their city. If they can stop the whole world from sinning but do not, they are held responsible for the sins of the whole world." This is reminiscent of the well-known adage, also in our Talmud, that Kol Yisrael aravim ze bazeh, all Israel are responsible for one another. In other words, the idea of loving rebuke is, yes, to become a better person, but also in a Jewish context, become a better member of one's community. Yet, we do not value rebuke simply for the sake of rebuke. It is instead meant to be meted out in particular ways. For example, rebuke should come at the appropriate time. The Sifrei continues to teach us that on account of 4 things, a person should not rebuke another except shortly before their death, just as Moses is now doing. These reasons are that one should not rebuke again and again, so that the other not feel ashamed in the rebuker's presence, so that the rebuker not bear a grudge in their heart, and so that the one who is rebuked should not choose to leave and go elsewhere. In other words, as Rabbi Bradley Artson from the American Jewish University in LA writes, this was the perfect time and place for Moses to offer these words, as a reminder to his charges that, for the last 40 years, they have fallen short of the sacred standards demanded of our Torah, and in this new generation, they can be encouraged to do better. That being said, any rebuke delivered should also seek to preserve the relationship between the two parties. So for example, and this I found really interesting when I learned it, in the ancient Jewish community of Qumran, rebuke preceded litigation, and in fact had to take place in front of witnesses before a trial could occur. It's not clear whether these witnesses were intended to act as preservers of evidence or as conciliators, but in all cases, it appears to be an attempt at an alternative form of dispute resolution in a community that was small, tightly knit, and did not have many resources to put towards a judiciary system. In other words, although the format has changed today, and another famous Moses, Maimonides, will later tell us that rebuke should be done privately, the idea of maintaining relationships remains critical in order that the community may function and even thrive. Maimonides will then continue to offer a further framework through which rebuke can be offered in his magnum opus, the Mishneh Torah. He firstly teaches that one is to be careful with the content of their rebuke. According to the Rambam, the rebuker should speak patiently and gently. This is because Maimonides believes that the primary objective of rebuke is to convince the transgressor to change their behaviour for the better. Therefore, they must be shown that this change is in their better interests. Rebuke should also be offered respectfully. Maimonides suggests that one could do this by phrasing rebuke as an ordinary question. He uses the example, perhaps not surprisingly in classic fashion, he uses the example of a teacher who has spoken words of Torah incorrectly, demonstrating that the student should ask the question of, "But teacher, you have told us such and such. You have taught us so and so." This way, the question is not designed to embarrass the teacher or whoever it is being rebuked, but rather it is aimed at eliciting a response of repentance. And we'll get there in a second. In short, there are parameters placed around the notion of rebuke so that it may not just be meted out appropriately, but also, just as importantly, effectively. We finally welcome rebuke because at its core, we believe that it is an opportunity for teshuvah. Again, it is Maimonides who gives us a timely suggestion, going so far as to suggest that rebuke is nothing more and nothing less than a mitzvah, in order to grant the transgressor the ability to complete a process of teshuvah. So we can now, with that thought in mind, ask ourselves the question, what is rebuke actually about? It is pertinent that we read this parashah as we find ourselves in the Hebrew month of Av, which in our calendar, by design, encourages us to be on this roller coaster of sorts through Jewish time, space, ritual, and emotion. As Rabbi Kay pointed out last night, and as we've been speaking about this morning, tomorrow is Tisha B'Av, the commemoration of the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem, as well as other numerous Jewish tragedies. We mark the day by fasting and by reading from the book of Eicha, Lamentations. We've heard echoes of this morning. Eicha itself is an extensive 5-chapter rebuke of the Jewish people, repudiating them for straying from the path of God, utilizing the metaphor of Israel as a scorned bride who has betrayed her beloved. It is, in other words, Israel at our lowest point, at our rock bottom. Yet, Tisha B'Av marks an important fulcrum on the pendulum of Jewish time. It is the culmination of our 3 weeks of mourning in which we have read Haftarot, which tell tales of admonition and despair. Nonetheless, if Tisha B'Av is Israel at rock bottom, we must find a way to climb out of the abyss, with this occasion also signifying, unbelievably, the start of the slow and steady upwards trek towards the High Holy Days. On that note, you may notice that, whilst they include words of rebuke, the Haftarot, as well as the book of Eicha, always end with words of hope, and indeed we just read of how Israel will be redeemed as a Kiryah Ne'emanah, a righteous city. And indeed, we shall read more of these words, which come from the book of Eicha, as we returned the Torah scroll to the ark just a few moments ago. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem. Return us unto you, O Adonai, turn us towards you, and we shall come back. Renew our days as the days of before. Additionally, from now up until Rosh Hashanah, we enter the 7 weeks of consolation, in which our Haftarah readings offer a vision for a brighter, happier, holier future, beginning next week with Shabbat Nachamu, named after the opening words of that particular Torah portion, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami, be comforted, my people. The parasha itself also took us on a similar emotional roller coaster from rebuke to comfort and back again and back again. Although Moses largely castigates the people, for example, because of how hesitant they were to enter the land of Israel after the report of the 10+2 spies, very important detail, so the 12 altogether, he then reminds the people that God has watched over them on their journey and has ensured they have lacked for nothing in their wilderness wanderings. Despite the rebuke, they are constantly reminded by Moses, Lo tira'um ki Adonai Elohechem hu hanilcham lachem. Do not fear, for Adonai, your God, will fight for you. Put differently, these final words of the parasha this week remind us, the people, not to be afraid, for their God is with them, warts and all. It is my suggestion, then, that rebuke can be a tool which assists us in regulating the emotional highs and lows of life and helps us to grow from them in a healthy way. Sure, we might be initially taken aback by any rebuke offered, but if done properly, we can use it to be constructive and improve ourselves and our communities. Back to our scene from before then of the customer screaming in the clothing store. We can now ask ourselves how this customer may have offered the rebuke in a much kinder, human manner. With everything we have learned from this parashah, from our text, from our tradition, and from the cycle of our Jewish calendar, some potential suggestions might include, for example, not yelling at the poor store clerk in front of other customers, not yelling at all, and posing their rebuke as a question that they might have sought a helpful answer together. To conclude this morning, our rabbis in Devarim Rabbah, a further collection of midrashim about the book of Deuteronomy, teach us that God said to Moses, "Since they have accepted your tochacha, you need to bless them." So Moses went and blessed them right away, and we learn that anyone who accepts tochacha merits a blessing. As such, let us end with a blessing in the form of a poem by Rabbi Cheryl Luart, who says things better than I ever could. May you be deliberate in judgment and base your decisions on kindness. Harsh judgment can be tempered. This is the time to be slow until bitterness and anger dissipate. May you do the best you can right now and trust that things will work out all right. May you be blessed with clarity and discernment and err on the side of generosity. Allow your vulnerability to surface as you calmly examine which voices speak truth. May you remember from the deep storehouse of your soul what it is like to be a stranger in a strange land, so that your heart opens in compassion for yourself and for all the world. Ken Yehi Ratzon, Shabbat Shalom.